Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stared at the overdue bills scattered across his desk. Running a small charter flight company wasn't easy, especially when bigger airlines kept stealing his customers. At 28, he had put everything into Morrison Aviation, but the bank was getting impatient about his loan payments. His phone buzzed. Cutting through the silence of his tiny office at the regional airport, Jake grabbed it quickly, hoping for good news. "Morrison Aviation, this is Jake speaking. I need a flight immediately," came a crisp, professional voice. "How soon can you be ready?" Jake straightened up. Emergency flights usually paid well. "Where are you headed?" "Hawaii. I'm Victoria Sterling from Sterling Enterprises. I have a business meeting that cannot wait. My corporate jet had mechanical issues and I need to be there by tomorrow morning." Jake knew that name. Sterling Enterprises was one of those huge companies you saw on the news. He pulled up the weather report on his computer, and his stomach dropped. A massive storm system was moving across the Pacific. "Ma'am, I have to tell you, there's some really bad weather between here and Hawaii right now. It might be better to wait until—" "Mr. Morrison, I'll pay you $50,000 for this flight. Cash." Jake nearly dropped the phone. $50,000 would solve all his problems and keep his business alive for months. But that storm looked nasty. "The weather's really dangerous, Ms. Sterling. I don't think—" $60,000. Jake closed his eyes. His father had always told him that sometimes you had to take calculated risks in life. Maybe the storm wouldn't be as bad as the forecast predicted. Maybe they could fly around it. "I'll need you here in 30 minutes, he said finally, "and I want half the money up front." 25 minutes later, a black luxury car pulled up to the hangar. Victoria Sterling stepped out and Jake felt his breath catch. She was stunning, with dark hair pulled back in a perfect bun and wearing an expensive business suit. But her beauty wasn't what surprised him most. It was the stress he could see in her eyes, the way she kept checking her phone every few seconds. "Mr. Morrison, I assume?" She extended a manicured hand. "Just Jake is fine." He shook her hand, noticing how cold it felt. "Ma'am, I really need to explain about this weather. I've already transferred $30,000 to your account. You'll get the rest when we land." Victoria glanced at his small single-engine plane and frowned. "This is what we're flying in?" "She's reliable," Jake said, patting the side of his Cessna. "But about that storm—" "Mr. Morrison, 3 years ago my father died and left me his company. Tomorrow, I'm finalizing a merger that will either save Sterling Enterprises or destroy everything he built. I cannot miss this meeting." Her voice cracked slightly. "Please, I'm trusting you to get me there." Jake saw something in her eyes that reminded him of himself when he was fighting to save his own business. Sometimes desperate people had to rely on each other. "All right," he said, "but we're doing this my way. If the weather gets too bad, we turn around. Deal?" "Deal." Jake helped her into the passenger seat and ran through his pre-flight checklist twice. The plane was in perfect condition, but he couldn't shake his uneasiness about the weather reports. As they taxied to the runway, he tried calling air traffic control for an updated forecast. "Morrison Aviation, this is Tower. That storm system is intensifying. We strongly recommend delaying departure." Jake looked at Victoria, who was gripping her phone tightly. "Did you hear that?" "I heard," she said quietly. "But I still need to go." Against his better judgment, Jake requested clearance for takeoff. The first hour of the flight went smoothly. Victoria worked on her laptop while Jake navigated around the smaller clouds. Maybe they would get lucky. Maybe the storm wouldn't be as bad as predicted. But then the sky began to change. Dark clouds rolled in like a massive wall, and the wind started buffeting the small plane. Jake's hands tightened on the controls as he tried to find a path around the storm. Victoria looked up from her laptop, her face pale. "Is this normal?" she asked. "Just a little turbulence," Jake lied, fighting to keep the plane steady. The rain hit them like bullets against the windshield. Lightning flickered in the distance, getting closer with each flash. Jake's radio crackled with static as he tried to contact air traffic control. "We need to turn back," he shouted over the noise of the storm. "How much further to Hawaii?" Victoria yelled back. "About 3 hours, but—" A massive gust of wind lifted the plane and threw it sideways. Victoria's laptop went flying and she grabbed onto her seat with white knuckles. Jake wrestled with the controls, his military training kicking in. He'd flown through combat zones, but this storm was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. "Jake," Victoria screamed as lightning lit up the sky around them. That's when it happened. A brilliant flash of electricity struck the plane's wing. Every instrument on Jake's panel went dark. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The silence was terrifying. "What's happening?" Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "Engine's out," Jake said, forcing himself to stay calm. "And we've lost our electronics." The plane began to drop. Jake could feel Victoria's terrified eyes on him as he tried everything he knew to restart the engine. Nothing worked. "They were going down. Are we going to die?" Victoria asked. Jake looked at her, this powerful woman who controlled a billion-dollar company, now completely helpless and depending on him. He thought about his father, about all the emergency landing procedures he'd practiced but never hoped to use. "Not if I can help it," he said. Through the storm and rain, Jake spotted something that made his heart jump. A small dark shape in the ocean below. "An island, hold on tight," he told Victoria. "This is going to be rough." Jake angled the plane toward the island using every skill he'd learned in the Air Force. The plane was dropping fast, too fast. The waves below looked hungry and violent, but that little strip of beach on the island was their only chance. "Jake, I'm scared," Victoria whispered. "I know," he said, focused entirely on the approaching ground. "But I've got you. Trust me." The plane hit the beach hard, bouncing twice before skidding through sand and palm trees. Metal screamed against rocks. The windshield cracked. And then everything went quiet except for the sound of rain on the damaged roof. Jake's shoulder was on fire with pain, but he was alive. He turned to check on Victoria, who was unconscious with blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. "Victoria!" He reached over to check her pulse. Still beating. Still alive. That's when he smelled the smoke. Fuel was leaking, and something was sparking in the engine compartment. Jake ignored the pain in his shoulder and unfastened Victoria's seatbelt. He had to get her out before the plane caught fire. Using his good arm, he dragged the unconscious woman from the wreckage and carried her up the beach, just as the plane erupted in flames behind them. Jake collapsed in the sand, holding Victoria protectively as the rain soaked through their clothes. They were alive but stranded on what looked like an uninhabited island in the middle of nowhere. As consciousness faded from blood loss and exhaustion, Jake's last thought was simple. Now the real survival would begin. Victoria's head felt like someone was hitting it with a hammer. She tried to open her eyes, but the bright sunlight made the pain worse. Everything was fuzzy and confusing. Where was she? Why did her whole body hurt? Slowly, memories started coming back. The storm, the lightning, the crash. No, she whispered, forcing herself to sit up despite the dizziness. This can't be real. She looked around and saw Jake sitting nearby, trying to fashion some kind of shelter from palm fronds and pieces of wreckage. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, and there were cuts and bruises all over his face. "You're awake," Jake said, relief clear in his voice. "How's your head feeling?" "Terrible." Victoria touched the bandage on her forehead and winced. "What happened?" "Where are we?" "We crashed on an island. You hit your head pretty hard, but you're going to be okay." Victoria looked around at the tropical beach, the smoking remains of the plane in the distance, and the vast ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The reality of their situation hit her like a punch to the stomach. "This is your fault," she said, anger replacing confusion. "I told you how important that meeting was. You should have turned around when the weather got bad." Jake stopped working on the shelter and looked at her calmly. "You're right. I should have. But we can't change that now. Right now we need to focus on staying alive." "Staying alive? For how long? When is someone coming to rescue us?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "Victoria, our emergency beacon was destroyed in the crash. Our radio is dead. We're way off the normal flight path because of the storm. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying it might be a while before anyone finds us." Victoria felt panic rising in her chest. This couldn't be happening. She had a company to run, a merger to complete, a life to get back to. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands. "No signal," she said, staring at the screen. "No signal at all." She tried calling 911, her assistant, anyone. Nothing worked. The phone might as well have been a piece of plastic. "The nearest cell tower is probably hundreds of miles away," Jake said gently. Victoria threw the phone down in frustration. "Do you understand what you've done? That merger was worth $2 billion. My whole company depends on it." "I understand you're scared and angry," Jake said, still working on their shelter. Despite her accusations. "But right now your company doesn't matter. What matters is water, food, and shelter. In that order." "Don't tell me what matters," Victoria shouted. "You're just a pilot. You don't understand what real responsibility looks like. Jake stopped what he was doing and looked at her with tired eyes. You're right. I'm just a pilot. But I'm a pilot who spent 4 years in the Air Force learning how to survive in situations like this. And I'm a pilot who pulled you out of that burning plane when you were unconscious. Victoria felt some of her anger deflate. She looked at the burned wreckage and realized she didn't remember getting out of the plane. You saved me? The plane caught fire right after we landed. You were unconscious and bleeding. I got you out and carried you up here to safety. Victoria stared at Jake, really seeing him for the first time since she'd woken up. His shoulder was obviously hurting him badly, but he'd been working on their shelter instead of resting. There were burn marks on his hands, probably from pulling her out of the burning plane. She started, then stopped. I didn't know. It's okay, Jake said, going back to weaving palm fronds. You hit your head pretty hard. Confusion is normal with a concussion. Victoria watched him work, feeling ashamed of her outburst. This man had risked his life to save hers, and she'd responded by blaming him for everything. What can I do to help? She asked quietly. Jake looked surprised. Are you sure? You should probably rest, I'm sure. Tell me what to do. Jake smiled for the first time since she'd woken up. Okay, first thing we need is fresh water. See that grove of palm trees over there? Some of those coconuts might have milk we can drink. But be careful. Don't try to climb anything with your head injury. Victoria stood up slowly, fighting another wave of dizziness. She'd never gotten water from a coconut before, but how hard could it be? 30 minutes later, she understood how hard it could be. The coconuts that had fallen naturally were either empty or rotten. The good ones were high up in the trees, and every time she tried to shake the palm trees, nothing happened except making her head hurt worse. Having trouble? Jake asked, walking over with an armload of useful-looking debris from the plane. These things are impossible, Victoria said, frustrated. How do people make this look so easy in movies? Jake picked up a sharp piece of metal from the plane wreckage. Military training. Watch this. He threw the metal piece at a cluster of coconuts high above them. On his third try, 2 coconuts came crashing down. Show off, Victoria said, but she was smiling. Jake used a rock to crack open the coconuts. The milk inside was warm and sweet, and Victoria realized she was incredibly thirsty. This is actually pretty good, she said, drinking gratefully. Coconut milk is great for hydration, but we'll need real fresh water soon. I spotted what might be a stream on the other side of the island, but I wanted to make sure you were okay before exploring. Victoria looked at Jake's injured shoulder. You shouldn't be doing all this work. You're hurt too. I'm fine. No, you're not. Let me look at that shoulder. Victoria had no medical training, but she could see that Jake's shoulder was swollen and he couldn't move his arm properly. She carefully helped him adjust the sling he'd made from torn clothing. Thank you, Jake said. But Victoria, I need you to understand something. This isn't going to be easy. We might be here for days or even weeks. Are you prepared for that? Victoria thought about her comfortable office, her luxury apartment, her regular meals at expensive restaurants. She'd never even been camping before. I don't know, she admitted. I've never had to survive on my own. Everything in my life has always been handled by other people. Well, now you're going to learn, Jake said, and I'll teach you. But it's going to require us working together. As the afternoon wore on, Victoria began to understand just how much she didn't know about basic survival. Jake showed her how to identify which plants might be safe to eat and which ones to avoid. He taught her how to build a signal fire that would create visible smoke. He even started showing her how to weave palm fronds together to make their shelter more weatherproof. You're actually pretty good at this, Jake said as Victoria successfully wove her first section of palm frond wall. It's like a puzzle, Victoria said, concentrating on the pattern. I'm good at solving puzzles. Business is probably full of puzzles. Different kind, but yeah. Victoria paused in her weaving. Jake, I owe you an apology. What I said earlier about this being your fault, that wasn't fair. We both made the decision to fly in that storm. You were scared and hurt. I understand. That's no excuse for being cruel. Victoria looked at him seriously. You saved my life, and I responded by attacking you. I'm sorry, Jake nodded. Apology accepted. But Victoria, we're going to be under a lot of stress while we're here. We're probably going to say things we don't mean. The important thing is that we stick together. As the sun started to set, they sat by their small fire, sharing another coconut and watching the ocean. Victoria had never seen a sunset quite like this. brilliant orange and pink stretching across the entire sky. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Yeah, it is," Jake agreed. "Too bad we can't enjoy it under better circumstances." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Jake, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you really take this flight? I know the money was good, but you knew how dangerous it was." Jake stared into the fire. "My aviation company is 3 months behind on loan payments. If I don't come up with a significant amount of money soon, I'll lose everything my father and I built together. Your flight was going to solve all my problems, and now I'm probably going to lose the business anyway, assuming we ever get rescued. But at least we're both alive." Victoria felt a pang of guilt. Her insistence on making that flight had put both their futures at risk. But she was also starting to see Jake differently. He wasn't just some reckless pilot. He was a man trying to save his family's legacy, just like she was. "We'll figure it out," she said, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. We're partners now, right? We're going to get through this together, and when we do, we'll figure out the rest." Jake smiled. "Partners. I like the sound of that." As night fell over their little island, Victoria realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about board meetings or profit margins or corporate strategies. She was thinking about tomorrow's challenges, finding fresh water, improving their shelter, and figuring out how to signal for rescue. It was terrifying and exhausting, but it was also strangely liberating. For the first time in her adult life, her problems were simple and immediate, and she wasn't facing them alone. "Get some sleep," Jake said, banking the fire so it would last through the night. "Tomorrow we explore the island and start working on a real rescue plan." Victoria lay down on the bed of palm fronds Jake had prepared for her, using her ruined business jacket as a pillow. The ground was hard and uncomfortable, but she felt safer than she had any right to feel. "Jake," she said quietly. "Yeah, thank you. For everything. We're going to be okay, Victoria. I promise." As she drifted off to sleep, Victoria realized she believed him. This man she'd known for less than a day had already proven he would risk everything to keep her safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they would face them together. Victoria woke up to the sound of crackling wood and the smell of smoke. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then reality hit her like a cold wave. The island. The crash. Jake. She sat up slowly, her head still aching but much clearer than before. Jake was sitting by a small fire, poking at what looked like fish wrapped in large leaves. His shoulder was still bandaged, but he moved with less pain than yesterday. "Good morning," he said without looking up. "Breakfast is almost ready." Victoria looked around their little camp. In just a few days, Jake had somehow turned this patch of beach into something that actually felt livable. Their shelter was bigger now, with palm fronds woven tightly to keep out rain. There was a neat pile of firewood, containers for water, and even a small area where he'd been trying to signal for help. "You've been busy," she said. Jake shrugged. "Had to keep my hands occupied." "How's your head feeling?" "Better." Victoria stood up and walked over to where he was cooking. "Jake, I want to help more. Really help. Not just sit around feeling sorry for myself." He looked up at her, surprise in his eyes. "You sure? It's not exactly corporate boardroom work." "I'm tougher than I look," Victoria said firmly. "My father didn't raise a quitter." Jake smiled for the first time since they'd crashed. "All right then. First lesson starts after breakfast." The fish was actually delicious, seasoned with some kind of island herbs Jake had found. As they ate, Victoria found herself studying this man who had saved her life. In her world, she was used to people wanting something from her, but Jake just seemed genuinely focused on keeping them both alive. "How did you learn all this survival stuff?" she asked. "Air Force," Jake said, tending to the fire. "Spent 2 tours overseas before I came back to start the aviation business. We had wilderness training, escape and evasion courses. Never thought I'd actually need it like this." "Why did you leave the military?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "My dad got sick. Cancer. He'd always dreamed of having a family aviation business, so I came home to help him build it. He died 2 years ago, but I kept the company going." "Been struggling ever since?" Victoria felt a pang in her chest. She knew what it was like to inherit a dying parent's dreams. "My father built Sterling Enterprises from nothing," she said quietly. "When he died 3 years ago, the board wanted to sell everything to the highest bidder. I fought them. I've been fighting them ever since, trying to prove I'm worthy of his legacy." Jake looked at her with understanding. That's why the meeting in Hawaii was so important. It was my last chance to save the company, Victoria admitted. And now, hey, Jake said gently, we're going to get rescued. And when we do, you'll figure out another way. People like us don't give up. After breakfast, Jake started teaching Victoria the basics of island survival. First, how to find and purify drinking water. Then, which plants were safe to eat and which ones to avoid. Victoria listened carefully, taking mental notes like she was in the most important business meeting of her life. Corporate skills actually help here, Jake observed as Victoria quickly learned to weave palm fronds. You're organized, you pay attention to details, and you're not afraid of hard work. I just never had to do the work with my hands before, Victoria said, wiping sweat from her forehead. Everything in my life has been about managing other people, making decisions, reading reports. This is different. Good different or bad different? Victoria thought about it. Surprisingly good. When I improve our shelter, I can see the result immediately. When I make our signal fire better, I know it might actually save our lives. In the corporate world, you make a decision and sometimes you don't see the results for months or years. They spent the morning improving their camp. Victoria proved to be a quick learner, and Jake found himself enjoying having a capable partner. She had good ideas too, like creating a rain collection system and organizing their supplies more efficiently. You know, Jake said as they worked on expanding their shelter, you're not what I expected from a CEO. What did you expect? Someone more demanding, I guess, entitled. Most of my wealthy clients treat me like hired help. Victoria stopped weaving and looked at him. Is that how I treated you when I hired you for the flight? Jake hesitated. At first, maybe, but you were desperate. I understand that now. I was horrible to you, Victoria said, shame in her voice. I was so focused on my own problems that I didn't think about the risk I was asking you to take. You could have died because of me. We both made that choice, Jake said, and we both survived it. In the afternoon, they worked on making their distress signals more visible. Jake had been maintaining a signal fire, but Victoria suggested they also spell out help in large rocks on the beach and hang bright pieces of clothing from the plane wreckage on tall palm trees. In business, visibility is everything, Victoria explained as they dragged pieces of metal to catch sunlight. You want people to notice you from as far away as possible. Smart, Jake agreed. See? Corporate skills. As the day grew hotter, they decided to explore more of the island to find better materials for their camp. Jake led the way through the jungle-like interior, pushing aside thick vegetation. Victoria followed, marveling at the exotic birds and strange plants around them. It's actually beautiful here, she said, watching a bright blue bird flutter overhead. Yeah, it is, Jake agreed. Too bad we can't enjoy it under better circumstances. They found a small freshwater stream deeper inland and several fruit trees. Jake was examining some unfamiliar plants when Victoria spotted what looked like a tidal pool near some rocks by the water. Jake, look at this, she called out, walking closer to investigate. The rocks were slippery with algae, and Victoria didn't realize how unstable they were until it was too late. Her foot slipped, and she fell hard against the sharp coral edge of the pool. Pain shot through her leg as she cried out, "Victoria!" Jake rushed over, forgetting about his own injured shoulder. Blood was flowing from a deep gash on Victoria's calf. The coral had cut her badly, and she was trapped between the rocks with her leg bent at an awkward angle. Don't move, Jake said, his voice calm but urgent. Let me figure out how to get you out of there safely. Victoria felt panic rising in her chest. She was stuck, bleeding and suddenly very aware of how far they were from any real medical help. Jake, I'm scared. I know, he said, carefully positioning himself to pull her free. But I've got you. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. It took several careful attempts, but Jake managed to extract Victoria from the rocks without making her injuries worse. He immediately used his shirt to apply pressure to the wound, stopping the bleeding. We need to get you back to camp, he said, lifting her into his arms despite his own shoulder injury. As Jake carried her through the jungle, Victoria realized something had changed between them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. The way he held her so carefully, the genuine concern in his voice, the fact that he'd risked hurting himself further to save her, it all meant something deeper. Back at camp, Jake cleaned and bandaged Victoria's wound with strips torn from their clothing. His hands were gentle but sure, and Victoria found herself watching his face as he worked. "You're pretty good at this rescue thing," she said softly. Jake looked up and met her eyes. "Getting lots of practice lately." For a moment, they just looked at each other. Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Complete trust in another person. This man had saved her life multiple times now, expecting nothing in return. "Jake," she said quietly, "thank you for everything. We're a team now," he said simply. "We take care of each other." As the sun set over their little island, Victoria realized that despite being stranded and injured, she felt safer than she had in years. Not because of their shelter or their supplies, but because of the man sitting beside her, watching over her as she fell asleep. A week had passed since the crash, and Victoria's leg was healing slowly. She could walk again, though with a slight limp. More importantly, she and Jake had found a rhythm together that felt natural and comfortable. Every morning, they would check their signal fire and scan the horizon for ships or planes. Then they'd gather food, maintain their shelter, and work on improving their chances of rescue. But the evenings had become Victoria's favorite time. That's when they would sit by the fire and really talk. "Tell me about your aviation company," Victoria said one night as they shared a dinner of grilled fish and tropical fruit. "What made you want to start it?" Jake poked at the fire with a stick. "It wasn't supposed to be just me. Dad had this dream of a family business where we'd offer charter flights to people who couldn't afford the big airlines. Flying should be for everyone, not just the wealthy." "That sounds wonderful. What happened?" "Big corporations kept undercutting our prices. They'd offer flights at a loss just to drive us out of business, then raise their prices once we were gone." Jake's voice grew bitter. "We couldn't compete with companies that had millions in backup funding." Victoria felt her stomach twist. "Companies like Sterling Enterprises?" "Exactly like Sterling Enterprises," Jake said, then immediately looked apologetic. "Sorry, I didn't mean—" "No, you're right." Victoria stared into the fire. "I've approved strategies like that. We called it market consolidation. I never thought about the families behind those small businesses." Jake looked at her with curiosity. "You really didn't know?" "I knew the numbers. I knew we were eliminating competition. But I never met the people we were eliminating." Victoria felt tears forming in her eyes. "Jake, I might have been responsible for putting companies like yours out of business." "Hey," Jake said gently, moving closer to her. "You didn't know. And you're not the same person now that you were a week ago. How can you be so understanding? I could have destroyed your life. But you didn't, and more importantly, you wouldn't now. People change, Victoria. This island has changed both of us." Victoria looked at this man who had every reason to hate her world, but instead showed her kindness she'd never experienced before. "You're not like anyone I've ever met, Jake." "Good different or bad different?" he asked, echoing her words from days earlier. "Very good different," she whispered. The next morning, Victoria woke to Jake shaking her shoulder urgently. "Victoria, wake up! There's a ship." She bolted upright and looked toward the ocean. In the distance, she could see a large cargo vessel moving slowly across the horizon. Without wasting time, they both ran to their signal fire. "It's not smoking enough," Jake said frantically, adding more green leaves to create thicker smoke. Victoria grabbed the pieces of metal they'd polished to reflect sunlight and started signaling desperately. "Can you see us?" Victoria shouted at the distant ship as if they could hear her. "We're here." For 20 agonizing minutes, they waved, signaled, and fed their fire everything they could find. The ship seemed to slow down for a moment, and Victoria's heart leaped. "They see us," she cried. "They have to see us." But then the ship resumed its course and slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. They stood on the beach in stunned silence, watching their rescue sail away. Victoria felt something break inside her chest. The disappointment was overwhelming. "Maybe they'll report our location," Jake said quietly. But Victoria could hear the defeat in his voice too. That night, neither of them had much appetite for dinner. They sat by their fire, both lost in their own thoughts. Victoria kept thinking about her company, her board meeting, the merger that had probably fallen through by now. Everything she'd worked for was gone. "Do you think anyone is looking for us?" she asked. "I'm sure they are," Jake said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "My assistant will have called the Coast Guard when I didn't show up. And your flight plan was filed for a direct route to Hawaii. They're probably searching hundreds of miles from here." Victoria felt despair settling over her like a heavy blanket. So we might be here for how long? I don't know, Jake admitted. But Victoria, look at me. She turned to face him in the firelight. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this. Something in his voice made Victoria's heart skip. She realized that somewhere between the crash and tonight, Jake had become more than just her rescuer. He'd become the most important person in her world. Jake, she said softly. Can I tell you something? Anything. Before this island, I hadn't felt truly happy in years. My life was all schedules and meetings and stress. I haven't laughed the way I laugh with you since I was a child. Jake moved closer to her on the sand. You know what's crazy? Despite everything, the crash, being stranded, not knowing if we'll ever get home, these have been some of the best days of my life too. Victoria looked into his eyes and saw something she'd never seen before. Not the polite interest of men who wanted her money or status, but genuine affection, care, maybe even love. Victoria, Jake said quietly, I need to tell you something too. What? I'm falling in love with you. Not the CEO, not the wealthy woman who hired me. You. The person who learned to build shelters and catch fish. The woman who apologizes when she's wrong and works harder than anyone I've ever met. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Jake, I know it's complicated. I know we're from different worlds, but I had to tell you. Instead of responding with words, Victoria reached up and cupped his face in her hands. Under the starlit sky with the sound of waves washing gently on the shore, she kissed him. It was soft and sweet and perfect. When they broke apart, Victoria rested her forehead against his. I love you too, she whispered. I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone. They held each other by the fire, talking quietly about their feelings, their fears, and their hopes. For the first time since the crash, Victoria wasn't thinking about rescue. She was thinking about how she never wanted this moment to end, but the next morning brought new problems. Victoria woke up feeling sick and feverish. The cut on her leg, which had seemed to be healing, was now red and swollen. When Jake examined it, his face went pale. It's infected, he said grimly, and it's spreading. Victoria could see the red lines extending up her leg from the wound. She'd heard enough medical dramas to know that was bad. What do we do? She asked, trying not to panic. I need to find some natural antibiotics. Some plants have healing properties. Jake was already gathering supplies. There's a part of the island I haven't explored yet. It's dangerous, lots of steep cliffs and rough terrain, but I might find what we need. Jake, no. It's too risky. Victoria, if this infection gets worse, you could die. I'm not losing you. The determination in his voice was absolute. Victoria realized this was what love looked like. Someone willing to risk everything for your safety. Please be careful, she whispered, touching his face. I will. Keep the fire going and rest. I'll be back before dark. Victoria watched Jake disappear into the jungle, heading toward the most dangerous part of the island. She'd never felt so helpless in her life. In the corporate world, she could fix problems with phone calls and money. Here, all she could do was wait and pray that the man she loved would come back to her safely. As the hours passed and her fever got worse, Victoria realized something that should have terrified her but somehow didn't. Even if they never got rescued, even if they spent the rest of their lives on this island, she would rather be here with Jake than anywhere else in the world without him. She just prayed she'd get the chance to tell him that when he returned. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness as the hours passed. Her fever was getting worse and the red lines on her leg had spread further up toward her knee. She kept the signal fire burning as best she could, but her strength was fading fast. The sun was getting low when she heard crashing sounds from the jungle. Victoria's heart jumped. Was it Jake or some kind of wild animal? She tried to sit up, but dizziness overwhelmed her. Victoria, Jake's voice called out. Relief flooded through her as he emerged from the trees, scratched and dirty, but carrying a bag made from large leaves. He rushed to her side, immediately checking her temperature and examining her leg. It's worse, he said grimly, but I found what we need. Jake pulled several different plants from his makeshift bag. This one is called neem. It's a natural antibiotic. And this is turmeric root. It fights infection. My survival instructor taught us about these. Working quickly, Jake crushed the plants between rocks and mixed them with clean water to make a paste. This is going to hurt, he warned. Victoria gritted her teeth as Jake cleaned the infected wound and applied the plant medicine. The pain was intense, but she could see the relief in his eyes as he worked. "You came back," she whispered weakly. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Jake asked, gently bandaging her leg with clean cloth strips. "I was scared you'd fall off those cliffs trying to save me." Jake touched her face tenderly. "Nothing could keep me away from you. Nothing." Over the next 2 days, Jake nursed Victoria back to health. He made her drink bitter teas from the medicinal plants, changed her bandages regularly, and never left her side. Slowly, the fever broke and the red lines began to fade. "You saved my life again," Victoria said on the 3rd morning, finally feeling human again. "We save each other," Jake corrected. "That's what partners do." Victoria looked at this amazing man who had risked everything for her multiple times. "Jake, when we get rescued," "When, not if," he said with a smile. "When we get rescued, I don't want this to end. What we have here, what we found together, I want to find a way to make it work in the real world." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Victoria, you know how different our lives are. You run a billion-dollar company. I can barely keep a small aviation business afloat. So we figure it out together," Victoria said firmly. "I've learned more about what really matters in these past 10 days than I did in 32 years of living. I'm not going back to the way things were." Their conversation was interrupted by a sound they'd been hoping to hear for days. Helicopter rotors. "Do you hear that?" Victoria asked, struggling to stand. Jake was already running toward their signal fire, adding armfuls of green leaves to create thick smoke. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, and this time there was no doubt. It was heading straight for them. "Coast Guard rescue," Jake shouted, waving his arms frantically. The helicopter circled their beach twice before finding a safe place to land. 2 rescue workers jumped out and ran toward them. "Are you Victoria Sterling?" one of them called out. "Yes! This is Jake Morrison, the pilot who saved my life." As the rescue team checked them over and prepared them for evacuation, Victoria grabbed Jake's hand tightly. She was terrified that once they left this island, the magic between them would disappear. "Whatever happens next," she said over the noise of the helicopter, "I love you." "I love you too," Jake replied, kissing her hand. The flight back to civilization felt surreal. Victoria watched their little island disappear below them and felt like she was leaving a piece of her heart behind. The rescue team radioed ahead, and Victoria learned that massive search efforts had been underway for days. Her disappearance had made international news. At the hospital, doctors checked them both thoroughly. Victoria's leg wound was healing well thanks to Jake's natural remedies, and his shoulder had mended properly despite the lack of medical care. But as they were examined in separate rooms, Victoria felt the real world closing in around them. Her assistant arrived within hours, followed by members of her board of directors. Victoria learned that the merger deal had indeed fallen through, and Sterling Enterprises was in crisis mode. "We need to do damage control immediately," her assistant said, pulling out a tablet full of urgent messages. "The media is calling you everything from reckless to irresponsible. The board is talking about removing you as CEO." Victoria listened to the familiar corporate language and felt oddly detached from it all. 2 weeks ago, this news would have devastated her. Now all she could think about was Jake and whether he was okay. "Where is Mr. Morrison?" she asked. "The pilot? I assume he went home." "Victoria, we need to focus on— I want to see him now." Her assistant looked confused but made some calls. Victoria learned that Jake had been discharged and had taken a taxi back to the small airport where his damaged business was located. "I need a car," Victoria said, standing up despite her assistant's protests. "But the board meeting can wait." Victoria found Jake at his hangar, staring at the empty space where his plane used to be. He looked lost and defeated, so different from the confident man who had kept them alive on the island. "Hey," she said softly. Jake turned around and his whole face lit up. "Victoria!" "How did you get here?" "Borrowed a car from the hospital." She walked over to him. "How are you doing?" Jake gestured around the nearly empty hangar. "Insurance company says the plane was totaled. Without it, Morrison Aviation is finished. I don't have the money to buy another aircraft." Victoria felt her heart breaking for him. "Jake, I have an idea. If you're thinking about giving me money, I can't accept that. Not giving. Investing." Victoria took his hands in hers. "What if Sterling Enterprises partnered with Morrison Aviation? We provide the capital to rebuild, you provide the expertise and the vision, but we do it right this time, supporting small businesses instead of crushing them. Jake stared at her. You're serious? Dead serious. I've been thinking about this since we were on the island. My father's company doesn't have to be a corporate monster. It can be something better. Something that actually helps people. The board will never approve that. Victoria smiled. Then I'll convince them. And if I can't convince them, I'll find new board members who share our vision. Jake pulled her into his arms. You really think we can make this work? The business partnership and us? I think we've already proven we make a pretty good team, Victoria said, remembering their days of survival together. 6 months later, Victoria stood on the beach of their island again, but this time by choice. Jake's new aviation company was thriving, specializing in ecotourism and emergency medical flights. Sterling Enterprises had transformed into a company that prioritized ethical business practices and supporting small entrepreneurs. Hard to believe we were starving here just half a year ago, Jake said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Victoria leaned back against his chest, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Best thing that ever happened to me was crashing on this beach. Even though you missed the biggest business deal of your career, I made a better deal, Victoria said, turning around to face him. I found something worth more than any company. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ring he'd had made from a piece of metal from their crashed plane. Victoria Sterling, will you marry me? Victoria laughed through happy tears. You know, a week ago I would have said this was crazy. A CEO and a small-town pilot. And now I know that sometimes the craziest things turn out to be the most right. She held out her hand. Yes, Jake Morrison. I'll marry you. As Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, Victoria realized that losing everything had actually helped her find what she'd been searching for her whole life. Not success or money or power, but love, partnership, and a man who saw her for who she really was. Their rescue had saved their lives, but falling in love had saved their souls. A year later, they returned to the island for their honeymoon, arriving in Jake's new plane. This time they had a luxury resort room waiting for them, but they still spent their evenings on the beach by a small fire, talking and laughing like they had during those first magical days when they only had each other. Some love stories begin with grand gestures and fairy tale moments. Theirs began with a crash landing and a desperate fight for survival, but Victoria wouldn't have changed a single moment of it, because it led her to the love of her life and taught her what really mattered. In the end, they hadn't just survived the island. They'd found home in each other.